The loss was instantly felt. As soon as I was taken away, put on a houseboat for a week, waiting till the investigation died down because the FBI was involved looking for me. That world dissolved as the plane flew further and further away. So I knew instantly that something happened. So I was still only 4. I didn't realize how final it was. Wanting my dad to come and rescue me was a lot of my thoughts, crying myself to sleep at night. I just wanted him to come and rescue me from this world that was like the Twilight Zone and violent.
I was really close with my dad for the first 7 years of my life. He really was my best friend, and we just had so much fun together. I trusted him completely. When everything changed and I was made to believe that he doesn't love me, that he loves my brothers more than me, and all these really terrible things, it was a huge blow to my self-worth. All I wanted was my dad to love me.
I was pretty young when it started. So I do wonder who I would have been if that didn't happen, or if it would have started later.
I cannot remember any time before alienation, having not established an identity, and we are the identity of our alienating parent. That's who we think we are, and then we really struggle with autonomy and having a voice. Later on in life, nothing is our own. Somehow our identity is their identity, and we have to learn a way out of that.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Anti-Alienation Project. Thank you all for being here tonight. We're going to have a discussion panel on the topic of identity. For anybody watching or new to the project, it's important to know that all of us in this group have experienced a form of child psychological abuse that is currently known as parental alienation. Some people in this group have also experienced parental abduction. Parental alienation is a form of child psychological abuse when one parent, usually during a custody battle or divorce, uses coercive control to manipulate a child to reject their other loving parent without true justification. Speaking out against the abuse that we've experienced is crucial because there are millions of other alienated children out there right now being held mentally hostage who deserve to live in reality and have a relationship with both parents. So we speak out for them. The first question that I'm curious to ask you guys is, considering your identity and sense of self before the alienation versus after the alienation, what do you think are the major differences that you see in your own experience between the two?
I don't remember much before alienation. I was pretty young when it started. So I do wonder who I would have been if that didn't happen, or if it would have started later.
I was a really confident, outgoing, really self-assured kid. I said what was on my mind, even if people didn't like it. And after the alienation, I think from what I've heard from everybody in my family and in my life is that I changed completely, and was soon after diagnosed with childhood depression and anxiety, and things just took a turn.
Yeah, for me, I was a very independent toddler. I enrolled myself in daycare. My mom didn't know where I was. She finally decided to take me and enroll me in daycare. And that's when they said, "Oh, so you're Dawn's mother." So I was very outgoing, I was not afraid of anything until after being abducted and being put into a world where I didn't recognize anything. The only thing familiar was my mother, who was estranged for a period of time. So she was really unfamiliar. I didn't recognize her at first. So really nothing in the new world was familiar to me. And I subsequently, through all of the stuff that happened, ended up with an identity crisis. I didn't know what end was up. And coming out of it, I'm now discovering who I am as an adult. I'm learning who Dawn is now. And for the last 10 years, it's a challenge.
I suppose for me, alienation severe level started very early. So I cannot remember any time before alienation, because I believe it was happening from day dot pretty much. So for a child who's grown up in that space, having not established an identity, and we are the identity of our alienating parent, that's who we think we are. And then we really struggle with autonomy and having a voice later on in life. And just having any comments or perspectives, nothing is our own. So somehow our identity is their identity, and we have to learn a way out of that. And a lot of the time, that takes a lot of years of therapy and work, just trying to figure out how to have a voice and be heard safely without that evoked companion voice of our alienating parent in my head the whole time, because it's the first thing I would hear every single time. It's taken a long time to be able to get that little voice out of my head and to have my voice come in. And sometimes that voice still plays in. It's a long road. And even now, my identity, even if I speak about it or anything and I'm around my alienating parent, she'll deny it, undermine me, say that didn't happen. We're still getting those arrows shot at us, even when we do try and have a voice ourselves as adults. We're still undermined. And if they think for 1 second we're coming out of any kind of control or spell that they have over us, they really try a lot harder to get us back into the fold and work on our identity again, or lack thereof, and turning into them. So it's a very tricky road.
There's a few questions I have here, but I think I'm going to skip ahead if you guys are okay with that to this question. It's a two-part question. Have you experienced a sense of loss for the relationship with your targeted parent? I could even add a loss with the relationship with who you thought your alienator was. And how did those experiences of grief and loss, how do they still probably or possibly shape your identity?
For me, the loss was instantly felt. As soon as I was taken away, put on a houseboat for a week, waiting till the investigation died down because the FBI was involved looking for me. And then flying to Colorado, I knew that world dissolved as the plane flew further and further away. So I knew instantly that something happened. I may not have understood what it was at the time because I was just 2 months before turning 5 years old. So I was still only 4. And I knew something happened, but not being able to understand that this was so final. I didn't realize how final it was. Wanting my dad to come and rescue me was a lot of my thoughts, crying myself to sleep at night. I just wanted him to come and rescue me from this world that was like the Twilight Zone and violent. And I wasn't safe, and I wasn't that little girl that was outspoken and strong-willed and not afraid of anything. And now all of a sudden I'm afraid of everything. I'm afraid to say the wrong thing. I'm afraid to be in the presence of a stepsister. I'm afraid to touch her because that would lead to violence. There was so much that fear took over. And that loss of having someone that I felt so safe and confident and comfortable with was real. Again, not understanding it. This is all hindsight that I'm seeing this now. But as time went on, I didn't know the loss. I couldn't compute that. There was no way for me to measure what I lost because I didn't know what it was anymore. And after 44 years reuniting, that's when I felt the loss. And it's harder the longer it goes because it's more time and longer deception. That feeling was real, and it was really hard to adjust or acclimate or come to terms with the enormity of that loss. It was huge.
How has that shaped your identity?
So the identity crisis didn't get discovered until I found my father. So I had been going through life just reacting. And everybody just thought I was some hot-headed, red-headed hurricane. They just thought, oh my gosh, don't upset her. There's a lot of time in my life that was very volatile for me even. And I was acting out. I didn't realize I was acting out at the time. I was speaking out. I was reaching out. I was doing all these things for a reason, but didn't know until I found my father. And because of the way I was raised, I didn't realize I've never seen a therapist ever. It was never in the cards. It was never a suggestion. Just left to deal with all of my emotions on my own growing up. My mother didn't help me. None of that happened. But when I found my father and I started dealing with all those emotions and trying to figure out my way through this, I never even thought that I needed to go see a therapist until my boss came up to me and said, maybe you need to go speak to somebody. And I thought, what do you mean? And when she explained it to me, I thought, you think I'm mentally crazy? I really thought that's only for crazy people to seek help and talk to someone. I really didn't know that was even a thing. When I started going to see the therapist, that's when I found out I had an identity crisis. And so then it went from there. So that was in 2016, not that long ago. It was a lot to figure out. And because I think I had that time before and I knew who I was then, I think that makes it easier for me to reconnect to that little girl and be who I'm supposed to be, and then turn all of this pain and torture and violence into what I'm doing now. So that has become my identity. I talk about it because that is who I am. And I can bridge the gap now between what happened then and what I'm sharing now.
For me, it was really difficult because I was really close with my dad for the first 7 years in my life. He really was my best friend, and we just had so much fun together, and I trusted him completely. When everything changed and I was made to believe that he doesn't love me, that he loves my brothers more than me, and all these really terrible things, it was a huge blow to my self-worth because all I wanted was my dad to love me. And I thought throughout the 2 decades I was alienated, if my own dad doesn't love me, then there must be something really wrong with me. And if my own dad is this bad and like all the things I was made to believe about him, that he was honestly missing part of his soul bad, then I must have some of that really bad stuff in me too, because I come from him. And I think what they've shown now in this, with the psychology of it all, that the child internalizes that fear and hatred and rejects part of themselves. It definitely affected my self-esteem, carry that pain for so long. My mom always said one day I'm going to write a best-selling book called The Hole in My Heart about why my dad doesn't love me. And whenever she would tell me that, I would always just feel so uncomfortable. And I would get mad at her even when she said that. But I didn't know why I was getting mad at her. So I would just get mad at myself for getting mad at her. And that just sums up my life in one sentence. So I think it's had a huge negative impact on my self-esteem and my confidence. I can't say enough.
Maddie, can I ask a question? A couple of times I've heard you refer to your mum going to write a bestseller about the hole in my heart and why my dad didn't love me. Was she referring to you? That's a book about you feeling that, or is that a book about her feeling that about her father?
I've always loved to write. I've always written since I could hold a crayon. I would just write random letters, writing short stories. I've published some short stories. I just love writing. So I think she was just trying to weaponize my love of writing and tell me, since I was 9 years old, instill this belief in me or try to get me to want to write a book about how bad my dad was. And she had the title all planned out for since I was 9 years old, 20 odd years ago, that it would be called The Hole in My Heart. And the weird part about it is that I do feel like she put a hole in my heart.
Mm-hmm.
But I think she was projecting that. And I think she had a hole in her heart from her dad because her mom alienated her against her dad. So she didn't talk to her dad for years. They had a horrible relationship. For whatever reason, I think that when my parents split, I think that she couldn't stand the idea of him still loving me, but not loving her. And she needed me to have that same hole in my heart that she had. And even when I was most severely alienated, I was never going to write a book called The Hole in My Heart. It was never going to happen. So I think it was just her way of trying to use me to get at him even more, maybe. I don't know.
Like she was planting that seed and then you would take off with it.
How interesting. And do you feel like there might be a theme running through here? Like I spoke about a little bit earlier about how the alienator wants us to be like them, and that this could be part of it as well.
In my case, my mom, yes, my mom and her mom are best friends, very similar people, almost the same person, really. And they just wanted me to be the third generation, but I fought against that my whole life. And because of that, because I fought against it, I always had my own beliefs and my own convictions that were very different from my mom's. That got me into a lot of trouble.
Yeah. And I'm interested in hearing from Bree. Is this reminding you of anything? Is there anything that you'd like to share, Bree?
Yeah, I can relate to Maddie in a lot of that. And my mom also, I feel like my mom really wanted me to think exactly the way that she thought. And my role in my family was like being the therapist. So I was basically like my mom's little therapist. So the loss with my dad, I didn't really feel like I lost my dad until he actually moved out of state after their custody battle, which that's not the outcome I wanted to happen, which sounds really weird coming from an alienated child. But I didn't want my dad to disappear. Like, I didn't want him to not be, I didn't want him in my life, but he was really important to my little sisters. And so when he moved away, it literally felt like he died. And I was a senior in high school at the time, and I have three younger siblings. And for all three of us, or all four of us, me and my three younger siblings, it literally felt like our dad just passed away. And then I didn't see him for a few years after that. And then one of my sisters convinced me to give him a second chance. And so I did. And so we worked on rebuilding our relationship until my mom eventually sabotaged that relationship when we were adults. She like struggled with becoming an empty nester. So it all happened around the same time as my youngest sister getting married, and she didn't want there to be a chance that my dad might come to the wedding. And I was having my last baby. One of my other sisters was having her last baby. And we had talked about like, how cool would it be for dad to come visit us? How cool would it be for him to be able to go to our sister's wedding? And she had to squash that and not let it happen. So I did feel lost, but not totally right away. Like, I think that the alienating tactics really started when I was about 7 years old. And my parents didn't actually get divorced until I was like 14. So during that time, I didn't feel like I lost my dad until he actually moved away. But for my identity, it definitely did. It definitely shaped my identity in a way. Like, I've always wondered, is this really who I'm supposed to be? Or, for example, I don't think naturally that I would be a people pleaser, but I think I had to become a people pleaser in order to survive living with an alienator. Like, you just have to do what you have to do to survive. And making her happy and keeping her happy, trying to always guess what her emotions are to keep things under control. I don't think that I would naturally be that kind of person, but I had to be. And so it's been really like really interesting kind of just discovering like who I really am. And for a long time, I thought that I was like an empath. And I think that I have empathy, but I don't want to be an empath, like lacking boundaries and not being able to like let people have their own feelings and not take them on for myself. I'm really like working on, okay, you can have your feelings, like you can be mad, but I don't have to take that on. And whereas before it was like I would worry so much about how somebody else felt, especially my mom. So I think that's how it affected my identity. And I also did struggle a lot with my self-esteem and my self-worth. And especially, I don't look like my mom. I actually look more like my dad. That also really wrecked my self-esteem. So especially if I believed that he was a monster or whatever my mom said about him, and then I look like him, then I'm like, obviously, there must be something wrong with me.
Can relate so much of that story where I had to regulate my mom quite often, buy her gifts so that she would stop being mad at me or at whoever she was mad at. I look exactly like my dad, and I'm sure that was not something that was well received as I grew up and I started looking more like him. That probably was a constant reminder to her.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that did cause a lot of additional problems, but it did make me feel bad and lowered my self-esteem about who I was, because if he was such a terrible person, And I know I don't look like her, and then I must look like him. So it was always in the back of my head like that as well. Yep, for sure.
Can I ask a question? First, I want to say thank you, Bree, for sharing that. And thank you, Maddie, too, for sharing your story about your mum and the title and the book and everything. It's really powerful information. But I wanted to know, I'm really curious, how many of us in this group have gotten married and our targeted fathers have not been there, or targeted mothers, if that's the case? How many of us for our first wedding? I'm one of them. All of us.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering, how did that play into our identity? Because I remember at my first wedding, my grandfather actually walked me down the aisle. So he stepped in as my surrogate. I was very close to my grandfather. He was very normal range, I've come to realize. He was my touchstone. He was the person who taught me that there is safety, there is conversations that you can have, there are people looking after you. He taught me that's possible. So I had that seed. I think those of us who don't have that seed, that is a very hard place to bring someone out of as a therapist and teach them how to do that older. But if we've got at least one person in the family doing that, it gives us that unconditional positive regard. But I just remember at the wedding, he walked me down the aisle and I was thinking, what are people going to think about this? This is like the story of my life. My dad's never around. And I remember one of the guys, my ex-boyfriend, he was there and we were still good friends. I like to be friends with my exes and keep the space clear. And he actually said to me, why isn't your dad here? And he goes, come to think of it, he goes, where is your dad? He goes, you don't speak about him. He goes, as long as I've known you, you've never mentioned him. And I was just like mind blowing. Like I got so trained to not talk about him. And here I am at a wedding and this person like brings this up. So I just wanted to, in my identity, I was still like, wow, that's really screwing around with my identity. Here I am getting married. My dad's not here. How's this looking to everybody? Did I want him here? Oh my God, what would happen if he'd been here? Like my mum would have probably not come. But then later on, when I got married a second time, 20 years later or whatever it was, he was at my wedding. And so was my mum. And that's a whole different kettle of fish to talk about. But identity played in at that point, and it was weird because no one had seen my dad in my family for years. And so here he was, brave enough to step into the space and be my father taking me down the aisle. And it was amazing, but it was also really diabolical because of the hate that was coming at him from a lot of the people who were in the wedding party who'd been poisoned against him. So I just thought, with regards to identity and weddings and stuff, I was just wondering, Bree, what was that like? Or Dawn or Maddie, what was that like for you girls?
My stepfather is the one that walked me down the aisle, and I hated every minute of it. And even putting the garter on, I could not stand the fact that he was putting the garter on my leg. It was just such a negative day for me. So it wasn't a happy wedding, and it was just really weird. It didn't feel right. I'll never do it again. Never do that type of ceremony again. And I'll admit this. I actually took my wedding photo and I superimposed my father's face over my stepfather's face, just so I could have something that was tied to him instead of my stepfather.
How did that tie back to your identity, Dawn?
It feels like that's the way it should have been from the beginning. Like all of this world where everything was the Twilight Zone, it just didn't feel real. So by putting his face over that, that felt more real. That felt like that was what was supposed to have been. He was supposed to be the one that walks me down the aisle. So it's almost like I'm taking my identity back by saying who I am. I had my name changed back to my birth name because of all the subsequent name changes, which is a whole nother piece to the identity issue. I needed to have control, wrong or indifferent. I needed to have control over the wedding day. And that's the only way I can, is to change the photo. It's not something that I put in a a frame or anything and hang up. I just needed to do that for that time. At that time, when I saw, because when I look at it, I hate looking at the wedding photos. It's just, it doesn't seem real.
Yeah, I also have a hard time looking at my wedding photos. I didn't wear a whole lot of makeup. I wore some makeup, but I didn't wear a whole lot of eye makeup just because I look like my dad. And I felt like crying just knowing that he wasn't going to be there to walk me down the aisle. It was really hard. It just really hit me on that day. And so when I see my wedding photos, I'm like, I'm not as glamorous as I thought that I should be as a bride. And then my dad isn't in any of the pictures. So that's really painful because it's like my husband has his side of the family, like everybody on his side of the family, and his mom and his dad are both there. And then for me, it's like my mom and my stepdad. And my mom and stepdad at that time had only been married for just a few years. And I actually had my grandpa walk me down the aisle, like at the beginning, and then like halfway through, my stepdad joined in. But I didn't really want my stepdad to join in walking me down the aisle because he's not my dad. But it felt really forced because he was paying for the wedding. And so my mom and my stepdad were really offended that I just wanted my grandpa because I couldn't have my dad. And it's weird because, like, at that time, I was sad about my dad not being there, but it also, like, I was also alienated. So I was angry at my dad. I didn't really understand why I was angry at him. I just believed whatever my mom had told me about him, like he's a terrible person. But it was my wedding day, and I'm like, this is the day that my dad's supposed to be here for me, and he's not. But yeah, I don't know. My wedding pictures are hard to look at. And I married my best friend. Like, I adore my husband. We're best friends. And so it has nothing to do with not loving my husband or appreciating my husband or that our marriage didn't work out. It's like literally just being an alienated kid and not having my dad there. It was really hard. And I didn't do much dancing on my wedding day at our reception because I literally wanted to crawl under the table and cry. But I was the bride. I couldn't. So I just sat at the table most of the time. My husband was out dancing because he's very extroverted and life of the party, but I was really struggling.
I struggled too during the reception. In fact, they busted open some, oh boy, this is really admitting to things. Someone brought cocaine. I'm like, give me that. I needed an outlet. I needed to just make it and survive this reception and looking at all the other families from my husband's side. And then there's my mom and stepdad, and that's the only family from my side. Nobody else came. That was it. So, and my kids, of course, my stepdaughter and my one son that was born before we got married. Yeah, I was like, help me on this. And so I partook.
How about you, Maddie? What was it like for you?
I had a lot of the same feelings about having a wedding that you guys are describing. So I decided we're going to elope and we're not going to have a wedding. And I already had my daughter. She was 5 months old when we got married, just the three of us on the beach. And we had a photographer for pictures. But looking back on it, it's so interesting to me because a big part of the reason why I didn't have a wedding was that I didn't want my dad to walk me down the aisle. And at the same time, I planned to get eloped. We eloped at the beach and I planned it when my mom was out of the country because I knew that she would drive to the beach if she got wind. I think there are probably a bunch of different dynamics that alienated kids have with their alienator. But for me, it was not a good relationship. It was me fighting her my whole life and being told I wasn't a good daughter and her begging me to never leave her and one big guilt trip pretty much. And so I knew she would not respect my boundaries of wanting to just have it done alone and she would come. So I made sure I did it when she was out of the country. And I think it is the best decision I could have made at the time. But recently, now that I have become really close with my dad, part of me does wish that I could have had a wedding and that I could have celebrated my marriage because I love my husband a lot. And if I hadn't had these terrible experiences, I think I would have chosen to have a wedding, but I did the best I could. I If you guys are ready to move forward a little bit, unless you would like to say anything, Elise, I have another question. Let's see. I have two questions. So the question I have is moving into after you learn the truth and reconnect with your targeted parent. Can you share an instance where you felt a profound shift in your identity during the process of healing or reconciling with your alienated parent?
Got one that instantly comes to mind, which is bang, it blew my mind. Again, I have a lot of that. But when I went out with my dad and we went for the first time since we'd reunited after, what was it, 28 years or something. When I first saw him, I didn't recognize him at all. He was not the person that I had been taken from. And I had the same experience as Dawn. We were abducted and taken on a plane, and everything from then changed. But then when I reunited with him and I agreed to meet him at a restaurant bar in Sydney on the water, because he's a yachty and a big boat guy, and so Sydney waterways are his thing. So I went and met him in his territory. I wanted to see who his friends were and all that sort of stuff. So we went to the Doyle's Cafe with all the Doyle boys that he grew up with. And so here, for the first time ever, I was on his turf in his space with people who actually loved him and liked him and had great stories about him. And I'm like, what? This is a totally different perspective. Like, this guy actually people like it's the first time I'd ever heard it. And I remember standing there and we were at the bar and he ordered a drink and I was down the other end and we ordered exactly the same drink, and we were laughing and joking with two of the baristas and the serving staff there, and we were laughing about the same things and joking about the same thing. And I could hear him and I'm like, that's not what I just said. And then I said something and I said, it was like, it dawned on me we were the same personality. We're both really extroverted and really like love talking to people, and we're really engaging and ordered the same stuff. We're laughing the same. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm him. And it was bang. From that moment, I thought, oh my God, how am I going to bridge this? Because I'm looking at a man who looks completely different as the one in my head. I've got to get used to the fact that this person's my father. This is how he looks now. I am him. We are the same person. And somehow I've got to get my mind wrapped around this. So that was a big moment for me. And gradually, over a long period of time, maybe a year or more, when I saw him, I wasn't as surprised as how he looks now. But it took a long time to get my mind around that, because in my head, I still had him as a very young girl with him as my dad as 5, 6, 7, 8. And he was a cool looking dude. He looked like Elvis Presley to me. I was just in love with him. I just loved him so much. And I had that love for him still, but it was the love for a different looking person. So I just remember that moment at the bar standing there when I realized, hell, we're the same person. Oh my God. And people like him. He's not the monster that I've been made to believe. That was my moment.
I can share briefly because a moment came to my mind too. And that's beautiful, Elise. Thank you for sharing. I love that so much. It's so beautiful. I have a similar type of feeling. 2 Christmases ago was the first Christmas my dad and I had where we had reconnected. And we both, for the first time, made each other homemade gifts, but we didn't plan it. We just both happened to make each other a homemade gift. And so I made him a shadow box with some old stuff from when I was a kid that I found, and some pictures of him with my kids and random memorabilia. And then he made me this, he cut down a tree because he loves trees and he has a couple 100 acres in a mountain house. But he cut down a tree and he made a Christmas ornament out of the wood. And there had been, I didn't know this, but he had kept this note at his desk since I was like 7 or 8 years old. So he's kept the same note that I wrote for him when I was 7 or 8 years old at his desk that whole time. It is still at his desk. And it's on a piece of toilet paper. And I had written, "Dad is my favorite person ever." And it was a picture of me and my dad. And the Christmas ornament came in with a long letter. And I read the letter first, and then I saw the ornament. And He had so precisely used a hot tool. I can't remember what it's called. Wood carving. He had used a tool to wood carve that exact picture I had drawn for him into the wooden ornament. It was so precise. I didn't know he had that artistic ability. And then he wrote an acronym on it, which we still tell each other often. He wrote MFPIMF. My favorite person is Maddie forever. And when I got that ornament gift and I opened it up, and I was still like trying to figure out all the truth at that point. It had only been about 6 months. I turned to my husband and I was like really tearing up, and I'm like, a dad wouldn't do this for his daughter if he didn't really love her, would he? And that's when the moment where I just accepted that my dad has loved me this whole time. He wouldn't have kept this little tiny toilet paper drawing at his desk. He wouldn't have made this ornament. So that was the moment. And I thought it was really cool that my dad and I both took a lot of time to make each other these homemade gifts, and we didn't plan it or anything like that. And he was really taken aback by mine. I think he had the same experience when he saw my gift, that he realized, wow, like she really was completely manipulated. Sorry, that was a little long-winded, but that would be my moment.
I love that. That is an awesome story.
I had to try and stop from crying, man. Oh gosh. It reminds me, Dawn or Bree, do you have anything like that too? Because Dawn, just reminded me of the story of your reunification that was videoed at the airport of when you reunited with your dad after 44 years.
There's so many things that kind of built up to the realization. So first, when I was talking to him and learning things like where I get my technical skills, where is my mechanical skills coming from? Because my mom was an artist and I'm not an artist at all. Learning where that technical side of me comes from, because I'm the only one in the family that has that skill. When I was talking to him and I'm learning this stuff, he actually got the same degree I got. He has a bachelor's degree in computer science. It's the same degree I have. So he was in the same industry that I'm in, which blew my mind. And then as we started talking more and more, he was very resourceful, and I am nothing if I'm not resourceful. I figured out that my tenacity comes from him because he would never give up and he would figure out ways to do things. I'm like, where does that come from? That's something that's very familiar. And just learning this as we talked more and more, my tenacity, my sarcasm, a root, and it came from him because my stepfather was very sarcastic, but almost in a very, what's the word when you're sarcastic to the extent that it's brutal, where my dad has sarcasm where he's trying to be funny.
That's called domestic violence, Dawn. It's on the DV list, that level of sarcasm. Yeah.
So my dad is always trying to make light of things, and I am always making light of things. And sometimes I feel like, is this my trauma or is this my genes? Is it my trauma that I'm responding with sarcasm, or is it just because that's who I am and that's how I would have responded anyway? And I think there's a combination of both, but I'm pretty secure in my sarcasm, and people don't necessarily understand it, but that's okay. I'm good with that. But when I walked off that plane and I'm walking and I could see him and I'm almost forgetting to breathe, and I'm trying to get through a crowd of people, and all I can see sometimes is the top of my brother's head because he's so tall. I could see the top of his head over everybody. So I knew I was going the right direction anyway. And when I finally got to him, and that embrace was like this, it felt so like I walked into a big teddy bear that just embraced me. And one of those moments, but it was still like this learning thing where we sat next to each other on the couch, and I started looking at my hand and looking at his hand, and I'm like, that explains that, because my mom has very petite hands and petite feet and a petite nose, and I just don't look like her. I have the same eyes and the same mouth, but the rest of me is my dad. I wondered, where did I get my red hair? Because my mom had dark auburn hair, and nobody else in half of her family is Greek. So where's the red hair come from? So she told me growing up that ancestors on our Greek side had red hair. I believed that. But I have not found any evidence of that. However, after I started finding my dad's family, after he passed away, I went up and met his cousins in Indiana. And one of the cousins was just rummaging through a big, huge tub of photos. And she's showing me family members, and she gets a hold of this one folder, and she opens it up and she shuts it and she just holds it to her chest. And I'm like, what? Show it to me. What is it? And she's just like almost in tears. And then she hands it to me and I open it up. It's my grandmother, my dad's mother, who has red hair. So that's where I get my red hair from. And it's just piece by piece like this, all the way up until I started producing that video that, Maddie, I was talking to you about when we did our interview last week. When I was putting this video together to the song, it's called Hey from Robin Slade, and it plays the credits on the Erasing Family documentary. And whenever I was showing this video for the documentary, we always stopped it as soon as the end. We didn't listen to the credits, or I didn't watch the credits, so I didn't listen to the song. And one day I walked away and I actually heard the song for the first time, and I'm like, me, that is me. That's the first thing I said to my father when we picked up the phone. The only word I could get out of my mouth when I heard his voice was, hey. And that's the name of the song. So I'm now in tears putting this video together. Every time I hear this song, it's just going to happen. Just accept it. The tears are going to fall. So I started looking at pictures, his pictures, and when he was a kid, and pictures when I was a kid, and I started comparing. I started putting them together, and that's the thumbnail of that video is pictures of us side by side during certain time frames in our life where I look like him. There is absolutely nothing that could change my mind that I absolutely look like him. So that video is the moment that I realized I am his daughter. And at the end of the video, it says, I am Dawn McCarty. And that's the moment. I made it through that. Didn't cry.
Woo, Dawn. And maybe we might get an opportunity to perhaps put the video in here so we can see it. It's a very short video, isn't it? But how about you, Bree? Did you have any of those moments yourself?
It's crazy. I haven't actually seen my dad in person since I realized I was an alienated kid. The last time I saw my dad was on his wedding day. That was almost 8.5 years ago. So I was at his wedding for his second marriage, but I didn't realize that I was an alienated kid. At this point, I still believed so much of what my mom had said about him. And this was before I went no contact with my mom, before my relationship with my mom completely crumbled. And it was shortly after that period, after my dad got married, when my relationship with my dad was sabotaged by my mom. So I'm still looking forward to finding these like golden nuggets in our new relationship. But we do talk on the phone, and there are times where I'm like, yeah, I can hear the resemblance on the way that we talk, or the certain things that we find funny that maybe somebody else wouldn't necessarily think that's funny. And also talking to some aunts and uncles and cousins on his side of the family, just since right now we have a family member who's really sick in the hospital. And so I've reconnected some of them to spend some time with this family member. And so some of them have talked to me about my dad and who he was as a kid and a teenager and stuff like that before he married my mom. And then it does make me think, oh, I can see that's probably where I get this from. But I haven't in person reconnected with my dad since discovering that I was alienated. It was actually during COVID when I realized that I was an alienated kid, and he lives out of state. So I have not been able to really make those new memories yet with him.
Thank you, Bree. So do we have time for the other question at all?
The last question is pretty short, so I think we do. And it goes along with the outro. So I'll just hop into it. It's a challenge, guys. So are you up for a little tiny challenge? Okay, so Before we end this panel discussion, I would like to end on a note of hope. All of you guys have touched my life deeply, and I can't even begin to explain how meaningful it is to have these conversations and speak out together. I wanted to share this quote that I'm pretty sure some of you guys have heard already, but for people listening, maybe who haven't. And the quote is from Judge Michael Haas, from what he told a parent during a divorce ruling in 2010, which is, quote, "These children are one half of each of you. Remember that, because every time you tell your child what an idiot his father is or what a fool his mother is, you are telling the child that half of him is bad." And on that note, I would love to conclude this panel by each of us going around and answering the following question. If you could go back and give your younger self one piece of advice or reassurance about your identity and who you are during the darkest times, what would it be?
I think for me, it would be that it is not, like, if I could tell my younger self something, it's not your job to fix the broken people in your family. Because I really took that on as my identity. And I was always feeling like a failure because I couldn't fix my mom. I couldn't fix my dad. I couldn't make the situation better. And so I think I would liberate myself from that responsibility because I did wrap my identity in trying to regulate my mom's emotions and being her therapist and trying to fix situations. And now I'm realizing there's more to me than that. Like, I'm not just my mom's daughter, I'm also my dad's daughter, and I'm also a mom and a wife and a sister and an aunt. There's more to me than just what I was supposed to be for my alienating parent.
I think for me, it would be that I think the most important thing for Demi to know would be you are your father's daughter and you always will be. Oops. Sorry. And that will be very important. And to don't stop looking, keep searching.
Do you need a moment, Dawn?
I'll be fine. Just trying to get it together.
Okay. For me, I just think back at that time, I was so involved in a world full of persecutory delusion and being part of a world of factitious disorder imposed on another. Everything that we were being told and forced upon us, we believed. And I don't know, I think my younger self was just struggling to survive, let alone make any sense of what was going on. Every single day was survival day and getting out of the path of the alienator. But in my heart, what I used to hear my intuition say was, your father loves you. So I knew, part of me, a tiny part of me knew that he still loved me, even though I was getting bombarded with information to suggest the opposite and that he was going to do terrible things to us. There was a part of me when I would go on the few contact visits that we had that I did, part of me was like, he's going to do all these things, but I also feel safe. It's a very bizarre world to exist in. And I'm glad that there's a part of me in my younger self who held on to that part about my dad loves me and I am safe with my dad. Because even when I reunited with him, I remember thinking, even as a young girl, as much as I cried because I was in major grief for many years missing him, that part of me never went away, and I held on to that when I reunited with him. So I think I'm happy that I didn't lose that belief, and I worry with the adult children that I work with that some of them might lose that belief. And when they lose that belief, they've really gone over to the dark side. They've really swallowed everything hook, line, and sinker, and there's no rationality or intuition being listened to in that space. I would say, thank God I listened to my intuition, and I suggest that other adult children in this space, if their intuition is speaking to them, please listen to it. It is your guide.
This one's hard. I think more than anything, I would just tell her that you're more than what your parent believes of you. And it's okay. There's always been this struggle for me. It's almost as if loving my mom and loving myself is not possible at the same time because I've never really had that loving feeling from her towards me. It's been more like constant criticism. And so I would just take her by the hand and just say, it's okay to accept yourself. You don't even need to love yourself, but it's okay to accept yourself. Even if the people you love the most won't accept or love you unconditionally, you're allowed to love yourself. And this is something I think I still need to work on. And maybe it'll be a lifelong thing. But I think that's what I would try to tell her. Thank you guys so much for taking your time out of your life tonight to participate in this panel discussion. I hope this has been meaningful or empowering and helpful. And again, I thank you so much for being here. I appreciate all of you. Elise, thank you for moderating. And I can't wait to see what we can accomplish together the rest of this year.
Thank you, everybody.